Undercover boss orders toast at neighborhood calf freezes when waitress explains tips don't cover bills. Under the scorching midday sun of July, the Elmwood neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Heat shimmered up from the stone-paved road, casting the entire street into the typical silence of a sweltering summer day. The clock hanging in front of the old bookstore across the street had just struck 12:03 p.m. Elmwood Calf, one of the earliest branches of Foster's Coffee House, sat quietly on the street corner. Its red brick facade had faded with time interspersed with tall, wide glass windows opening out to the world. Inside, soft yellow light from pendant lamps gently swept across each wooden table, wrapping the space in a sense of familiarity, as if time itself had slowed down. Michael Foster, 50 years old, founder of Foster's Coffee House, walked into the cafe. He wasn't wearing a suit, no luxury watch. Just a middle-aged man in a worn gray polo shirt, beige khaki pants wrinkled at the cuffs, and a dark baseball cap shading his sun-tanned forehead. He came alone. No assistant. No announcement. Today, he wasn't here to give a speech or evaluate performance. He came to observe, to listen to the things that don't show up in reports, to see with his own eyes what was really happening in the place that bore his name. Michael paused near the counter, glancing briefly at the menu boards on the wall. White chalk letters read sourdough toast and house brew $6.95, surrounded by pastel chalk hand-drawn flourishes. No one noticed him. A few customers sat with laptops or flipping through newspapers. A few younger ones ordered drinks while scrolling on their phones. The scene was peaceful until he approached the empty table by the large window. The table had no reserved sign, no indication it had been saved. Just a two-seater beside a small lavender plant and a half-empty water carafe. Michael pulled out a chair. As he set down his bag, a woman's voice spoke up calm but cold. That spot is for regulars. You can't sit there. The speaker was Rachel Moore, morning shift manager at this branch. In her early 30s, Rachel wore the Foster's uniform, neatly a metal name tag pinned on hair tied back. She stood upright, arms folded in front of her stomach, eyes not meeting Michael's, as if he were someone to remove, not someone to serve. Michael looked up, not out of surprise, but to observe carefully every nuance of her expression, every pause in her voice. He didn't stand. He didn't react. Just tilted his head slightly as if waiting for a more reasonable explanation. Rachel's tone didn't change. She added, this time quieter, but equally rigid. We keep that table for people working nearby. They come off and use the app to earn points. If you didn't reserve, please sit in the back section. Each word was evenly spoken, polite in a textbook kind of way, but sharp as a thin blade. There was no outright hostility, but also not a shred of respect for the man before her. Michael still said nothing. His hand rested on the table's edge, thumb gently tracing the worn wooden rim. He had once approved this table design, chose ash wood over pine for durability while preserving a friendly, homey feel. Back then, he told the design team, I want whoever places their hand here to feel welcome. And now, this very table was rejecting the man who created it. He nodded slightly, as if grateful for a clue that had just been revealed. Then, without argument, without resistance, he stood and walked toward the back of the cafe where smaller tables lined the brick wall.
A spot that wasn't prominent.
Dimmer. Less foot traffic. And also a place where no one paid him any attention. No one realized who he was. No one noticed the faint Foster's logo on his collar. And that was exactly what he wanted. From his table, he had a full view of the brewing station and service area. He didn't need cameras. Every glance, every word, every gesture was living data. A young male employee emerged from behind the bar carrying a water tray. A female server adjusted the sugar packet organizer. In the far corner, an elderly guest tried to request more milk, but was ignored. And Rachel, still behind the counter, continued chatting with two regulars, her laugh louder than the coffee machine's hum. Michael placed his phone on the table screen down. He didn't need recordings. What mattered was being etched into his memory and his heart. Outside the window, a light breeze stirred, rustling the white curtain above the glass. Inside, the atmosphere flowed on as usual, except for one thing: someone was sitting there quietly about to uncover a truth that his own system may have let slip. And he was ready to face it, layer by layer. Beneath the quiet light of the leaning noon sun, the sound of the coffee grinder seemed to slow, as if all of Elmwood Calf had paused to listen. To a voice not loud, but strong enough to spark something deeper than any slogan ever written. "I already told you," Rachel repeated, this time slower and more evenly. "This isn't a seat for someone like you." The final two words were released gently, not overtly malicious, not loud but sharp, like a blade slicing through the surface of what's considered polite. No one in the calf looked up immediately, but someone blinked.
Someone stopped typing on their laptop. Someone glanced up from their phone screen.
The atmosphere began to shift in an invisible way. Michael remained still in that moment. His feet hadn't left the chair that was just denied to him, but his back had straightened. His hand still rested on the worn fabric bag, not clenched, not withdrawn. A soft breeze from the air conditioner brushed through the salt and pepper hair beneath his cap. He nodded, not in agreement, but like a man confirming something he had long suspected. Then, without a single word of rebuttal, Michael withdrew his hand, removed his cap with a slow turn, and walked over to the smaller table by the brick wall in the back. The table still bore the water ring from someone's peppermint tea. A crumpled napkin sat quietly on the tray. No one had cleared it. Michael didn't wait for anyone to. He pulled out the chair, placed his cap on the opposite seat, and sat down. His posture didn't change, back straight, eyes forward. But no gesture indicated any reaction. No resistance. No anger. No performance. Only silence. A silence deep enough to force every other sound in the room to check itself. Rachel glanced over. There was no regret in her eyes, but there was a flicker of surprise at seeing him stay. She didn't understand why. As if something instinctual told her the man was supposed to quietly retreat, like so many before him had done in similar moments. But he didn't leave. And his silence wasn't just silence. A barista named Theo looked toward the back of the calf, his hand pausing mid-motion while opening the caramel syrup bottle. He didn't know who the man was, but he could sense something had shifted, like something sacred in the daily routine had just been touched. At a table near the counter, a young woman holding an art magazine looked up, then pretended to look down again. But her hand had stopped flipping pages. An older man in a white shirt, sitting near the window with a coffee cup in hand, observed Michael for a few more seconds.
Then turned his gaze toward Rachel.
He said nothing.
But his eyes recorded something.
Michael said nothing. But he saw everything. The way Rachel stepped back behind the counter as if finishing a small task that didn't warrant attention. The way none of the staff smiled, but none stepped forward either. The way the calf kept operating like a stage play that had forgotten real people were watching. And what made everything even clearer was how time inside the calf seemed to slow down. He sat with his hands relaxed on the table, head slightly tilted as if listening to the soft background music from the ceiling speakers. But in truth, he was observing, not just with his eyes, but with memory. The memory of those first mornings at Foster's when he still stood behind the counter, handcrafting his first cappuccino, serving it to an elderly lady while listening to her speak about her husband, just admitted to the hospital. Back then, he once told the founding team, if Foster's can't be a place where anyone walking in feels like they matter, then we should shut down before we ever expand. And now it was he himself being tested by those very words. He didn't respond to Rachel, but his eyes rested on a sign behind the counter, Foster's, where everyone deserves a seat. He stared at that sign for a long time, then looked back toward the service area, and waited. Not for a drink, but for the truth from the very people the system once trusted. Under the soft, yellow light spilling diagonally through the frosted glass of Elmwood Calf, the air seemed to retain its tranquil summer noon rhythm. But after Rachel's cold words, everything had already begun to crack. And then, as if following a script written in advance, a young server appeared from behind the counter. His name was Joe. The boy's face was still youthful, his hair slightly tousled, but his voice carried a firmness so cold it felt devoid of emotion, as if he were repeating something he'd heard or been taught so many times that it no longer felt strained. Joe walked straight to the table where Michael was seated. His hands were empty. No smile. No greeting. Just one sentence, sharp as a line drawn across the air: "We don't serve your kind." No emphasis. No explanation. The last 4 words were released lightly like a breath, yet carried the weight of a verdict. Your kind? No one asked what kind, but everyone understood, each in their own way. But the shared feeling was they were witnessing something wrong. A young customer typing near the window froze, fingers suspended above the keyboard, eyes tilted toward the scene. An elderly lady with glasses stirring her peppermint tea paused. The sound of her spoon clinking against the glass grew louder than the hum of the air conditioner. A mother holding her child near the kids' play area looked up, then gently covered her child's ear, not because the words were loud, but because they felt too raw.
Michael didn't raise his head right away.
He sat still, not with the stillness of submission, but of someone watching the truth reveal itself. He knew. That sentence hadn't come from Joe, not entirely. It came from something older, deeper, a silent cultural system that allowed people to decide who deserved service simply by how they looked at them. One breath. Michael calmly placed both hands on the table. His eyes met Joe's, not angry, not lowered.
Just a steady, cold composure.
I'd like a menu. The words were soft, but sent a ripple like static through the room. No one had ever responded that way. No one had ever met an excluding dismissal with a direct, simple, composed request. Joe blinked. He hadn't expected that. He expected someone to bow their head and leave, or at least argue giving him a reason to ask them to go. But this was the first time he'd seen someone ask for a menu. No raised voice. No justification. Nothing more than the most basic right in a caf to be served like everyone else. Joe turned his head toward Rachel, seeking instruction. But Rachel said nothing. She stood behind the counter, arms crossed, eyes now flickering with hesitation. She hadn't expected him to stay, and even less for Joe to be stopped by stillness. No one in the caf spoke. But the atmosphere shifted. Something like conscience began stirring behind glances. No one intervened, but everyone started to feel that something wasn't right. And it wasn't the man sitting there. Michael sat upright, hands interlocked on the table. His gaze no longer on Joe, but toward the distant glass window where sunlight filtered through the trees, casting speckled light across the tiled floor. That look, not accusatory, not defiant, somehow made Joe feel exposed. He took a step back, didn't say anything. Didn't turn away, but didn't move forward either. He stood there, caught in between, unable to serve, unable to retreat. A young woman in a beige Foster's uniform clearing tables in a far corner slowly stopped what she was doing. She glanced at Joe, then at Michael, and lowered her head. No one had acted yet. But every small detail was beginning to shift. No one touched their water glasses anymore. No more quiet conversations continued. For a few short minutes, Elmwood Caf had become a stage of something no one could name when silence begins to speak. Michael turned back to Joe. He didn't repeat his request. He didn't need to. His refusal to leave was confrontation enough. Not with words. Not through words, but through presence. The presence of a man rejected by prejudice, yet who chose to stay to reflect light upon a place once built to be a refuge. While Joe still stood frozen, caught between service and exclusion, a quiet voice nearly drowned in the thick atmosphere rose from behind the counter. "I'll bring the menu." Every head turned instantly. It was Emily, the new trainee, a petite girl in a pale beige uniform. Not even 2 weeks had passed since her first day. Every morning she arrived 30 minutes early to wipe down every table edge. Few noticed, but it was her small hands that folded the napkins neatly onto trays even when no one asked. Emily had never been noticed at Elmwood Caf, but today she was the first to speak against the silence eating away at the place. Rachel widened her eyes at her. The manager's lips tightened, ready to say something sharp, but then just a long glare and silence continued to spread. Emily didn't wait. She quickly stepped to the shelf and picked up a paper menu. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze held steady. She walked toward Michael, step by step as if treading a tightrope between right and wrong. And just a few steps away from him, she paused. Not out of fear, but because for the first time, every gaze in the cafe was on her. Michael looked at her, not with the eyes of a CEO inspecting a trainee, but with the gentle look of someone witnessing a small act of kindness standing up to a storm. Emily nodded lightly, then placed the menu on the table. She said nothing more. She turned to leave. But before she could take a step, Michael spoke still with that calm, low voice, "Thank you." 2 words. That was all. But that thank you was like an anchor holding fast to what had begun to drift from Foster's kindness, courage, and fairness. Joe clenched both fists. Not out of anger at Emily, but because he just realized his silence was no longer neutral. It was complicity. Rachel began fidgeting behind the counter. She pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly as if trying to prove she was still in control. But the truth had become clear. Power didn't lie with the one holding the shift schedule, but with the one who held onto decency. Emily returned to her workstation. Her frame was small but steady. She didn't know who the man was. She only knew if she stayed silent today, someone else would hear the same words tomorrow or worse. Michael opened the menu. His eyes scanned the items as if truly choosing a dish. But in truth, he was rereading his own vision line by line, because every dish at Foster's carried a philosophy he had written from day one, simple, honest, and for the people. And then, as if fueled by Emily's quiet courage, something unexpected happened. A middle-aged customer sitting near the cashier stood up. His name was Mr. Allen, a longtime regular who once gave feedback on their dark roast recipe. He put down his cup and walked over to Michael. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Michael nodded. "I'm okay. It's just, I think they made a mistake." Michael smiled faintly. Not just today. 2 men, one the founder, one a loyal customer, standing in the same space but representing 2 extremes, the excluded and the once privileged. Mr. Allen fell silent for a moment, then said, "If I've sat at that table before and no one said a word, then maybe the problem isn't you. It's the way we've gotten used to injustice without ever naming it." That sentence not loud, but resounding. Rachel spun around, her voice beginning to crack. "Sir, could you please sit down and enjoy your drink?" But Mr. Allen simply shook his head. "I don't sit still when I see wrong." And then another staff member, Sarah, who had often been favored by Rachel for always following orders, stepped out of the kitchen. She said nothing. Simply removed her apron, folded it neatly, placed it on the counter, and walked out of the cafe without a single word. The silence that had dominated at first had now given way to action. No protests. No shouting. Just individuals, one by one, choosing to stand. Joe finally stepped back. He looked at Emily, then at Michael. A short nod, but one that said, "I understand." Michael saw it all. Not to document it, but to remember it deeply. He needed no further proof. The system was rotting not because of revenue, but because the people within had forgotten the original reason they came here, to serve, not to judge. And that was when he reached into his shirt pocket, ready for what came next. Under the soft golden light streaming through the large glass window, every sound inside Elmwood Cafe seemed to vanish. No more chairs sliding. No more spoons clinking against cups. Only the quiet breathing of those witnessing something that had never happened before. Michael Foster stood up. He didn't rush. Every gesture seemed premeditated, not out of habit from power, but from the resolve of someone who had walked through many disappointments and come back stronger. His hand touched his shirt pocket. No urgency. No dramatics. The phone appeared in his palm as if it had always belonged there, and with a single press he raised it to his ear. "Julia, initiate Protocol 7. He didn't lower his voice, nor did he need to raise it. The volume was just enough for everyone to hear, not out of curiosity, but instinct. That instinct that whispers, "Listen to this. It matters." A female voice responded from the other end, firm, professional, without hesitation. "Ready, Mr. Foster?" Michael said nothing more. He lowered the phone, slid it back into his pocket, and began walking. Not through the customer aisle, and not turning aside to avoid anyone's gaze. He walked straight, each step on the tiled floor, landing like the measured tick of time preparing to shift. Rachel stood frozen behind the counter like turned to stone. Her eyes darted no longer the eyes of someone in control, no longer the eyes that judged customers minutes ago, but the eyes of someone realizing she had just lost something she might never get back. Joe, the server who had spoken words of exclusion, no longer stood upright,
His shoulders hunched.
eyes cast down like a child caught scribbling on the church wall. And now, no one looked at him with blame, but with something heavier disappointment. Michael stepped into the center of the cafe. Beneath ceiling lights designed to highlight the colors of their desserts, he needed no spotlight. His presence in the very space that had rejected him created a glow no bulb could replicate. He turned, face to face with the entire room that had tried to cast him out like an unwanted speck, and then he spoke not loudly, but with words that rang as though etched into the cafe walls. "I am Michael Foster." A pause. Short, but enough to make everyone feel like the whole cafe had missed a heartbeat. "The founder of Foster's Coffee House. I am standing in a branch that bears my name." Near the cashier counter, the soft clink of a dropped spoon broke the silence. No one picked it up. A middle-aged man reading the paper lowered it eyes wide. A college student beside him held a cappuccino cup but couldn't lift it, her hand trembled. Rachel blinked. Her fingers clutched the wooden counter until they turned white, as if letting go would send her falling. Her eyes, once full of authority, now filled with a rising fear, quiet but unstoppable. Joe looked down, hands gripping his apron as if trying to find a way out, but every door had already closed. Michael continued with that same voice. The voice of someone who had survived 1,000 boardroom meetings but now used it for something far more important than any profit report. "I didn't come here to inspect service speed. I didn't come to evaluate revenue or score latte art. I came because I once believed anyone who walks into Foster's deserves to be welcomed like family." He gestured toward the first table he had chosen, the one denied to him by the very people now standing in silence, and today I've been reminded that there are places and people who have forgotten that. The air turned heavy, not from accusations, but from a naked truth now laid bare in the middle of the room, unshielded. No guest moved. No one left. Because they knew they were witnessing something important. Not just for a brand, but for a way of living. A girl around 10 years old tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, who is he? Why does it feel like nobody dares to say anything?" The mother didn't answer. She just looked at Michael and gave a gentle nod, as if passing down the right thing to the next generation. Michael took another step forward. Not directed at anyone in particular, but his eyes scanned each face in the cafe. Not to accuse, but to silently ask, "Do you still remember why we started?" And then he concluded with a simple sentence. "No dramatics. No performance. This is the moment we pause so we can begin again." No one objected. No one denied it. Because when the truth stands in the middle of the room, all excuses become meaningless. Michael Foster didn't take his eyes off the room, steeped in silence. He didn't need to emphasize anything more. Because now that his identity had been revealed, there was no room left for pretending. And he didn't need a grand climax. He hadn't come here to shut down a cafe. He came to rebuild it. He turned to the counter where Rachel stood, seemingly having lost the ability to speak. Rachel Moore, his voice steady and slow, as though each syllable touched the fragile boundaries of morality, effective immediately. "You and the entire midday staff are suspended from duty." Each word wasn't loud, wasn't sharp, but carried the full weight of a value system that he had just watched collapse in the very place that bore his name. Rachel didn't scream. She didn't argue. Though her lips quivered slightly, they finally closed like a door that had been forced shut after too many years of being left ajar. Joe didn't lift his face. His arms hung loosely, rubber gloves still on, but his entire posture had collapsed, like a building with no foundation. Michael gave a signal. The door to the left opened. Julia entered along with two senior operations managers, each carrying a handheld device and a folder marked Protocol Bevan. Julia, in a soft gray blazer, stepped toward the central table. She connected the device to Elmwood Caff's POS system. The cashier's screen flashed, then turned red. A message appeared: SEYSTEMLOCKDOWNUNDERREVIEW. Joe swallowed hard. Rachel stood frozen like a statue, but her hand slowly slid off the counter edge, dropping limply by her side. She didn't resist because she knew this inspection was unlike any before. Julia spoke gently but firmly. All internal access privileges have been revoked. The current shift schedule is canceled. Administrative rights at this branch will be transferred to the Central Operations Office until full restandardization is complete. No one responded, because every word touched a reality they could no longer deny. Michael walked over to the employee bulletin board hanging in the corner where a group photo of Rachel and her team on opening day was pinned. He took the photo down, flipped it over, glanced at the handwritten message, Elmwood Pride of March. He stayed quiet, folded the photo, and handed it to Julia. For record keeping. Nothing more than a brief instruction. Then he turned toward the remaining staff, those who had stood in silence, watching everything unfold, yet not daring to step forward. This branch, he said, will temporarily close for 24 hours, not to clean the physical space, but to clean something far more important, the service culture. Julia followed up quickly. All shifts starting this afternoon will be canceled. Employees wishing to join the retraining process must register directly through the internal link. The list will close at 3 p.m. today. A female server, her name was Dana, quietly stepped forward. A young woman, face still carrying signs of panic, but her eyes lit up as she softly said, "I want to stay. If I can." Michael nodded. "Thank you. But it's not just about staying, it's about starting over." He turned toward the original table, the one he had been denied. No one stopped him this time. No look stood in his way. On the contrary, a male staff member quietly stepped out from behind the counter, wiped the table quickly, then bowed his head, inviting him. Michael didn't sit down right away. He stood in front of the table, then reached for the chair, not like someone about to dine, but like performing a quiet ritual. "I'll begin again here," he said softly, "just like the first day I opened my first cap." Julia stepped forward from behind, handing him a signboard that read TRAININGINSASIONDONOTINTIR, UPT. Michael hung the sign on the table. Guests in the cafe still hadn't left. No one rushed to pay. An older gentleman pulled out his wallet, placed a bill on the table, and said to the staff, "I don't need change, but I'd like to contribute to the cafes tomorrow." A young couple whispered something to each other. Then the man turned and said, "We're happy to come back and join the training if you need customers to practice with." Michael chuckled lightly. Today everyone is a teacher if they're willing to listen. He sat down, not as a CEO, but as a customer, just like the many guests he had served over the past 20 years. The first cup of coffee was placed on the table. His hand wrapped around the white porcelain mug, and in that moment, everything Elmwood Caff had once lost began to return, starting with a single sip. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the west-facing window, light streaks spilled onto the old tiled floor, somehow sharper, clearer, as if the entire Elmwood Caff was waiting for one final gesture to close the chapter. Michael didn't sip his coffee yet. Instead, he pulled an old leather notebook from his shirt pocket, bound with cloth ribbon. The kind of notebook few people use anymore, except those who don't want their memories stored on the cloud. He opened it, flipped past ink-stained pages. The handwriting, slanted and distinct, was his. But some pages bore rounder, finer strokes from someone else. They were customer notes from the earliest days when Foster's was still a small cafe on Maple Avenue. He turned to a page that had already been marked. Then slowly, carefully, he pulled out a folded sheet. It was the original employee code of conduct from the very first Foster's branch. Just 5 rules. No one nearby could read the content, but Michael mouthed the words, his face gradually softening. Not from regret, but like a man touching again the reason he once started. He laid the sheet at the center of the table. Julia, still standing behind him, watched in silence. But this time, someone else stepped forward. It was Dana, the young server, who said she wanted to stay. She no longer looked timid. Under the warm lights, Dana stood upright, a menu in her hand, but she didn't offer it just yet. Mr. Foster, she began soft but steady for the upcoming training. Can we share what we've seen, both the good and the bad, to help rebuild from the inside? Michael looked up. For the first time that afternoon, a clear warmth shimmered in his eyes. Not the gaze of a CEO, but of a father seeing his child admit a mistake and choose to walk forward the right way. You have the right to do even more than that, he replied. You'll be part of the policy rebuilding team, and your voice will be included in the new reform plan. A small gesture, but enough to make Dana smile faintly. Right then, a sound rose soft as a breeze from among the customers. An older gentleman stepped forward. He was a regular, often sat near the window, rarely spoke. He walked up and held out an old photograph printed on glossy paper. Do you remember this? He asked. Michael took it. It was a picture from the opening day of the Elmwood branch 8 years ago. Back then, the CAF had only 4 staff members. And in the center stood Michael himself, wearing a brown apron, holding a tray of pastries, smiling with a weariness that couldn't hide the hope in his eyes. I was your first customer that day, the man continued. I remember you poured me the first cup of coffee and said, we don't sell coffee. We serve trust. Michael gave a gentle nod. If you return tomorrow wearing that same apron, I'll be your first customer once again, the man said, then stepped back to his seat, as if returning a debt held quietly for 8 years. No one said a word, but the atmosphere grew warmer. Julia stepped forward. This time, she brought no tablet, no forms. Only a small wooden box. She placed it on the table, opened it. Inside were laser-engraved wooden name tags, the kind Foster's used during its first year before switching to plastic to cut costs. Michael looked at each name tag. Each one carried a name, but no title. Just the name and a simple line beneath, I'm here to listen. He chose one and pinned it to his shirt. Dana did the same. Another staff member standing in the distance walked over and asked for one too. No instructions. No assignments. The shift had already begun through silence. Julia stepped back, then glanced at the clock. It's time for scheduled closing, she said softly. Michael nodded. He stood walking toward the entrance. But instead of leaving, he paused. His hand touched the wooden door handle, the U-shaped grip he had personally designed for the original store model. And then he did something no one expected. He flipped the sign hanging by the door from OPEN to see LOSAD, but didn't shut the door. He left it open, then turned to face inside, speaking clearly. Foster's isn't closing because we failed. We're pausing to reset. And starting tomorrow, anyone who walks through this door will be served not just with coffee, but with trust again. The entire CAF rose, not to leave, but to applaud. Not loud, not prolonged, just a crisp gesture like a quiet agreement we understand. Michael didn't bow. He simply looked around, then walked toward the counter, removed his name tag, and placed it on the serving tray. Tomorrow I'll begin again from this counter. Julia, standing beside him, quietly responded, and will begin again from you. No more words followed, only the golden evening light streaming gently through the window. On the bulletin board near the entrance, someone, whether staff or guest, no one knew, had added a new line to the updated core message, we don't sell coffee. We rebuild trust one cup at a time. Beneath the twilight light filtering through the leaves outside, Michael Foster paused at the threshold of Elmwood CAF, the place that had just witnessed one of the most profound turning points in the history of the brand he built. His hand gently rested on the wooden doorframe, his palm feeling every small scratch, traces of time and of all the people who had walked through. Some welcomed, some turned away. He didn't look back right away. Instead, He took a deep breath, as if trying to hold on to the scent of aged wood, the faint aroma of coffee in the air, and the quiet sounds born from awakening. Then, he turned. His voice rose not to deliver orders nor to offer explanations, but like a father giving his final words in a moral lesson to students who had lost their kindness after too long behind a cash register. Foster's wasn't built to become the biggest coffee chain. His voice wasn't loud, but so clear that every word seemed to touch a crack in the room. It was meant to be the smallest place that still kept its humanity. All eyes followed him. No more guarded stares. No more suspicion. Only the gaze of people being reminded of something once beautiful but forgotten. Michael slowly turned his eyes to the first table, the one he was denied where everything began. He spoke again, softer this time, but deeper. Fairness isn't a slogan hung on a wall. It's how we serve the quietest customer at the humblest table on a day no one is paying attention. A pause. Brief. But in that beat, no one dared to move. He turned toward the door and walked out, not hurried, not with his head held high, just steady steps, as if each one affirmed that some revolutions require no flags or drums. And right at that moment, as the wooden door hadn't even fully closed behind him, applause erupted. From table 3, then the one near the window. Then the whole space joined in, not in unison, not dramatic, but real. For the first time that day, a round of applause not for fame, not for power, but for courage of someone who chose to do the right thing at the right moment. Across the street, the light from the Foster's Coffee House sign reflected off the window, no longer dazzling but still glowing.
Glowing in a different way.
Tips can't save employees if the system is being manipulated. A tip can't patch the hole of injustice. When the structure is broken, kindness itself becomes a tool of silent endurance. A good CEO doesn't just look at numbers, they see the people who've been forgotten behind the bar. True sustainable growth doesn't come from polished reports, but from the ability to stop and see the weakest person in the chain. Fairness isn't in documents. It's in decisions. Choosing to see a person instead of a staffing slot. Choosing to treat someone as human, not as a potential customer or high performer. A brand can be built with reputation, but it only lives long if it preserves human values. Fame can bring first-time customers, but only kindness will bring them back. And if you ever forget that, remember every cup of coffee as a chance to prove you've still held on to humanity.